first subject in your book, a young lady named Maryanne, her story reads almost note for note of the story of Centoya Brown, the young black girl who, like Maryanne, murdered a person that I think she did sleep with him. She was pimped. She was using hard drugs. She confessed on a recorded police phone. Brown's case was able to get national attention due to memes and her depiction as a child with pigtails in her orange prison jumpsuit. And she was able to get much celebrity sympathy. She was released from prison after serving 15 years. Maryanne didn't get the same exact treatment, but she also went to a juvenile facility first. And she wasn't charged. No, she went to an adult facility first.
It's a little bit more complicated, but I'll
Oh, let's go. Let's go for it. Go explain Maryanne. Because I don't know if you saw the same things in those people, but I definitely did when I was reading it. I was like, oh man, this is like almost beat for beat the same story in and out of foster homes.
A couple of major important differences.
Okay.
So when Centoya Brown committed her crime, she was not in foster care. She had been adopted. She had been in foster care as a very young child. She had been adopted. And as you'll see in Wards of the State, one of the major roots, one of the major sort of inflection points where so many kids in foster care end up eventually locked up is broken adoptions. So anyway, so it might seem like niggling or a fine point, but there's an important difference. Also, there was a really large age difference between Centoya Brown and her victim. He was a man in his 40s. The situation with Maryanne was, I should say, when kids are in foster care, so they effectively have no one person, who is speaking for them, no parent, no real community. So I think it is easier for them to be invisible, frankly. There's really no one stepping up for them, advocating for them. Certainly the foster care system isn't once they've committed a crime. And so they're sort of, there's a public defender, but kids in foster care are kind of across the board invisible. And part of that is because of is the state, tries to prevent, say, media from getting too deep into foster kids' lives. And they say, oh, this is about protecting the young person's privacy or confidentiality. But what it really is protecting the system, because all the young people I talk to want to tell their story. They really want to tell their story. So that's one thing. The difference between having, a person who has claimed you as theirs, even though in Centoya Brown's case, I think this was not a successful adoption at all. But there was still a person who was sort of her person, her family.
I think the and we can touch on this later, and we don't have to mine through the minutia, but they're both poor young girls who do know their mothers, their birth mothers. And Centoya goes back to live with her mother, and she's kind of in and out of between her mother, the adopted mother. Then we don't have to, and then Centoya's story is whatever you saw in a meme, ain't it? Like it's definitely more than the meme. And what was kind of coming out, even in the little documentary about her in prison, I don't think tells the full story of that young lady. But she had a few advocates on her side, right? She had the district attorney that ended up teaching in the prison, that wrote the thing to keep her in prison, was like, oh, wait a minute, maybe she's not that bad, and she's part of a flawed system. Which is, how many people is that really going to happen to? That's something crazy that happens. And I was hoping that situation would open people's eyes kind of to the way we view young, poor kids who do commit violent crimes, that have lived kind of a life of trauma. And I think for me, maybe that was the through line between both young
Mhm.
ladies. They lived this life of trauma, and when you are of a certain class, and as your story illustrates, this goes beyond ethnicity.
Mhm.
Maryanne had no white privilege, right? I don't if she had it, I don't know what it is.
There's one possible thing.
What is that?
So, and there's a little bit on this in the book. So Maryanne, uh, who had no significant criminal history before her crime. She did have some. She had been popped for shoplifting and that kind of thing. The only real significant event prior to her pulling a trigger,
Mhm.
shooting a guy in the head, was um, she was running away from the police. And in running away from the police, she ran right into another
Yeah,
officer. She
and
broke
broke a
that
yeah.
officer's ribs. She ended up in juvenile detention after that. She was taken out of juvenile detention and put into a foster home pretty quickly. And that foster parent said, who happened to be a black woman, said, "Yeah, if Maryanne was a black girl, that never would have. That she would have been still in juvie. She would not have been removed." That
But
was
that's conjecture.
it's conjecture, absolutely. But
That's like people that said if January 6th would have been all black people, then everybody would have got shot. It's like, a lot of black people protest, and I haven't seen that
okay,
many
I'm
shootings.
just pointing out this a black woman said
Sure.
she felt that Maryanne did have a certain amount
I'm a
of
black man, and
privilege.
I disagree. How's that sound?
Okay. I mostly agree with you. I do not think that Maryanne
No.
benefited from tremendous white privilege in any way.
I mean, her story is I'm every page is just like a and I told you when we met on social media, I was like, I don't want to say I'm enjoying it because I think that's belittling the material or kind of weird, but it's uh illuminating, and I'm glad you are humanizing a segment of the population, as you said earlier, that is extremely invisible.
So I actually think it's okay to say you're enjoying this book because I wrote it to be this is not heavy policy book. There's policy in it and sort of why did this happen and how are we here? But really, this book is supposed to be helping a reader see through the eyes of kids on the street, on the run, in foster care, their experience. Yes, it is framed with, sort of how did we get to this place? But in the main, it is supposed to be, I hope it is, engrossing, propulsive. I see these as survival stories.
Yeah.
I think every young person in this book is living a really powerful survival story, and hopefully a reader goes, what happens next, then what happens to them, what happens to them, because that's how I felt.
Oh, no, I mean, the whole book is what happens next, right? I mean, if you are like, I hate to say this, if you're aficionado of the true crime genre, this is probably something that you would like, and I would want to push you to something like this more so than a story of a serial killer, because I do think those things build up calluses to our humanization of people. And I think true crime, the way we view it, it's just, you know, propaganda for kind of base narratives of good and evil. Um, so telling the story of this girl, telling the whole story, right? You even talked about the family members that spoke in the courthouse of the young man that she shot. I mean, if you want to tell, maybe we should explain who
Well, your
Maryanne
point is
is.
really well taken. This book started kind of true crimey. You are totally right. I this book, I certainly did not set out to write a book about foster care. That is not how this happened. How it happened was I was sitting in court watching this teenage girl be sentenced for murder, and I wasn't even there for her case. It was there for a completely different reason. I was sort of interested in the work of a forensic psychologist who was maybe going to testify about what he thought her sentence should be. So I was there to listen to him. He ended up never getting called, and Maryanne's sentencing ended up being continued over the course of 3 days, not consecutive 3 days, 3 days over several weeks. And by the end of it, I was no longer interested in this forensic psychologist, and I was completely interested in Maryanne. And I thought, oh, this is not really a crime story exactly. This is really a foster care story. And I had covered child welfare as a journalist, and I had covered a lot of youth crime as a journalist, and I had not properly appreciated the overlap. I had not properly grasped how one system kind of feeds the other. And that is when I realized, oh, Maryanne is actually part of a much bigger story. And here we are.
Do you want to tell the story about Maryanne briefly? Because she's a
Sure.
big part of the book.
She's the opening of the book. There are 6 main characters in the book, 6 main primary young people that I'm following in the book. She's one of them. And you mentioned talking about the family members of her victim in the book. So Maryanne was a kid who grew up just north of Seattle. She had been in what you would call a pretty neglectful home as a very, very young child, living with her mother. Her mother eventually was incarcerated, and Maryanne was taken away in a police action. At that point, she could have easily been taken into foster care, but she wasn't. She was basically handed over to her father, who she didn't know very well. She went to live with him when she was about 6. That became a really abusive situation. She was being held out of school a lot. A lot of people noticed, a lot of phone calls getting made, neighbors hearing screaming in the house, neighbors aware that a little 6 or 7 or 8-year-old girl was locked up alone with no food. Eventually, finally, after many, many phone calls and many problems at school, police finally did show up, and they did remove Maryanne, and she went into foster care when she was about 10. So that's number one. What age you go into foster care is a factor. Maryanne had already endured quite a bit of abuse and neglect by that point. And then, it became really interesting hearing kind of how she acted at the beginning. She would just cling on to people. She really liked the first people who took her in. They were an older couple. They had all these puppies around. It was near Christmas time. She really wanted to stay with them, but for various reasons, she didn't. And she was moved to a family friend. And this is a friend of her father's. This is kind of what the state wants to do, right? Put kids with people who are in some way connected to their families. This is a newer direction. This used to never happen. But this happened here, Washington State, trying to be forward-thinking and progressive. They placed Maryanne with this friend of her dad's, a woman. But a lot of times when kids are in foster care, they have really challenging behaviors. It's not like you just give them a hug and it's all good. Maryanne was extremely demanding of this woman's time. She would have tantrums, she would cry, she would cling. And this woman, I think, felt that she couldn't manage her life with a kid with this level of need. So she asked for Maryanne to be removed. But to Maryanne, this is a kid. This is a 10-year-old kid. She is not understanding an adult's perspective at all. To her, it felt like total rejection. And in fact, there was no real preparation for this. Nobody sort of counseled Maryanne and said, hey, you're going to be moving somewhere else. And
in so many days.
Right, in so many days, and this woman really still cares about you. It's just her own life, blah, blah. None of that. I don't know that it would have mattered anyway at that point. But this is what happens with foster kids. Their behaviors are really difficult in many cases. And the adult, the foster parent, calls the state and says, I can't. You got to get this kid out of there. And the social worker calls up, or the social worker pulls up, or the social worker shows up at school. And this is what happened to Maryanne, and says, your stuff's in the back of my car. You're going somewhere else tonight. Maryanne is now in her mid-20s, and she still says this to me all the time. Wow, she never even said goodbye. She never even said goodbye. This woman who had taken her in, this friend of Maryanne's dad.